the last Sunday of Lent. Scriptures have taught us so much during this season. We've been challenged to go beyond our human nature and begin to understand and realize that what God has given to us from the very beginning is far greater than just the fleshly side of our life. This flesh was intended to be able to house that which God gave to us in the very beginning, called either the spirit or the soul. That which is within us is the true man. The flesh is only that which we allow it to be or what we prepare it to be. If we prepare it to be like Christ, we will see the evidence of that in our lives. If we seem to prepare it in the way of man or the way of the world, again, we will see that preparation manifested in our lives. What God has done for us, what He has given to us, is so powerful, if only we believe. When He created man, in the preparation of that creation, He said, "Let us create man in our image and likeness." The plan of God was man was to be created like Him, His image, His likeness. Not to be Him, but to be like Him. When He formed man from the dust of the earth, He breathed man into that dust. That breath was life. And everyone that exists today has that life in them. Because all of creation has come from God, from no other source. Nothing exists that was not created by God. So therefore, that likeness and that image is in every one of us. Every creature that God has created has, as far as man is concerned, is created in that image and likeness. It's amazing how little we give respect to what God has done for us. It's amazing how that we instead listen to what others will say to us, and we will form thoughts or images in our own lives which are contrary to how God created us. Then we wonder, why? Why do I have this problem? Why is the world so corrupt? Why are things so evil around us? Why? Because we've chosen to walk our own way rather than walking the way that God created us to walk. As I've said many times, when we have that which God has given to us on one side and that which man has given to us on the other, we have conflict in the middle, and that conflict is that which brings about the suffering, the sorrow, the pain, and all the other things which are not blessings from God. Whose choice is it? Ours. If only we would listen to what God has said, follow it, He will fulfill what He promised. If you go back to the stories of old, especially the stories of Egypt, when Israel was in Egypt for 400 years as captivity, notice when Israel was taken into Egypt in the beginning, it was meant for their salvation. They were without food. There was famine. Egypt had food because of Joseph. God had sent Joseph there to prepare the world for this famine. But Israel, when they got into this, they decided they were going to stay. It was only for the 7 years that they were supposed to stay. But they stayed, and they ended up eventually in slavery because they were propagating so fast that they were larger in number than the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were afraid of them. So they put them into slavery. They didn't have to be in slavery, but they chose to be in slavery. And in many of our lives today, we choose to be where we are. We choose to let the enemy take over rather than walking in what God has prepared for us and given to us. Lent is this time wherein God reveals to us who we are and what he has done for us. What his character, what God's character in our lives does for us. And we find that he identifies himself in the Old Testament reading today. He identifies himself as Redeemer. He's a Redeemer. This is his character. John 10:10. We know the scripture very well. The enemy comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy. But I have come that you may have life and that you might have it abundantly. So we see the two characters here. Now, not only is this identified in John 10:10, but you have it also in the Old Testament, because God said, I put before you blessing and curse, life and death. Choose you this day whom you will serve. So we have that principle has been given to us. Choose the way you're going to live. God will allow that. He's not forcing any of us to do what he wants. He gives to us choice. But then the consequences of our choice are there. Proverbs tells to us that we must have discernment, that a man who has no discernment will destroy himself. What is discernment? Discernment is the understanding that for every action there is a reaction. What we do causes something to come back to us. If it's good, then good will be returned. If it's evil, evil will be returned. And so we have to comprehend that what God has established in the very beginning is based on these principles, giving us that freedom to choose. But the consequences are based on our choices. In the Old Testament reading today in Isaiah 43, it talks to us first about him being, he identifies himself as Redeemer. He also identifies himself as the Creator of Israel. So here on both sides, he is basically talking about that which has come from him. And he talks about that hope that is theirs because of what God has done for them. He tells us here, I make a way for them through the sea. A highway through the sea. A path through many waters, mighty waters. Now, this is a story of Old Testament making. But its foundation and its principles apply to life. In this life that we live in, we may walk through mighty waters, but we will walk through those waters on dry ground if we are walking with God. We are not bound by the situations. We are encouraged by our faith and our confidence in God. Moses obeyed God. He struck the sea divided. They were able to walk across on dry land. Why? Because they were obedient. They were obedient, and so that was the principle of what they received. This sea that saved Israel is the same sea, the same circumstances that destroyed Egypt's army. Depending upon whose faith you have. Situations might be for one death, but for another life. It might be a curse for one, but to someone else who believes in God, who walks with God, it may be a blessing. But we cannot just believe that everything is just one particular way, because God can turn all things to good. Whatever it may be, it can become good because we walk with God. And he tells us here, don't pay attention, don't call to mind the former things. Don't look at the things that have happened, the problems, the failures. Don't let those things remain in your mind and pull you down. Those things God takes care of if we put our faith in Him. He says, don't ponder those things. I'm going to do something new. He was looking forward to something which was far greater than the people had experienced at that time. And He's also doing that for us. He was speaking to Israel and saying to Israel, you've been in bondage and slavery for 400 years. You've been beaten. You've been put down. You've been embarrassed. You've been put to shame. Don't let that form your imagery or your mindset and fear and have anger and unforgiveness for what has happened. I'm going to do something new. He was looking forward to Canaan. He was looking forward to a land of milk and honey. But if they would not get rid of that old image, they wouldn't make it. And we know the story that most of those that came out died because they could not get rid of the bitterness, the hurt that had come upon them. He talks about how that he can make a roadway in the wilderness. He can put rivers in the deserts. This is imagery that speaks to us of those things which seem to be impossible. They are possible with God. He can take a wilderness and He can take a desert and He can turn it into a well-watered garden.
Amen.
I've told you before, going to Israel, going across the desert from Egypt to Israel. It's wilderness. I mean, it is wilderness. You don't dare open your mouth. You don't dare let your nose be open. You cover your face because the flies are so intense. They attack you. But as soon as you get to the border of Israel, it's like somebody has drawn a line across there. On this side, it's sand and wilderness. On the other side, it's trees, grass, and flowers. The difference of trust and faith in God. Here is a small nation, small, but yet one of the most powerful nations in the world. And probably the one nation that affects more other nations than any other nation does. We don't see that because the news doesn't tell us all of this. But Israel is helping almost 100 and plus nations in their agriculture and other things, how to have water, how to have all these things. They're helping all these people. Why? Because God said, these are my people I formed for myself. But thank God, He didn't just stop with Israel, but He also chose us, others, the Gentiles. And that which He has done for Israel, He will also do for us if we will trust Him and we will have faith and confidence in Him. Paul tells us in his writing, I consider everything worthless compared to getting an experience with God and to knowing Him. When he talks about knowing Christ, he's not talking about mental assent or mental understanding. He's talking about an experiential knowledge, a working relationship with Christ. This is what Christ wants with us. He says in the New Testament, fellowship with Him. That's partnership. What He can do, you can do in partnership with Him. This is why Jesus said, the things that I have done, you shall do. But even greater than these things you shall do. Why? Because you're more than me. I'm only one, but you are a multitude, and many more things will happen. A relationship, a partnership with Christ. This is what He desires of us, not us walking on our own, but us walking together with Him and sharing what He has given to us. In the gospel today, we have the story of this gentleman, the master, that has created a farm. I believe it was probably a vineyard, but anyway, it was a farm. And when he has created this farm, and there are several different records of this in the scriptures, when he's created this, he then goes abroad. For some reason, he leaves the area, and so he turns his farm over to tenants. This farm has been prepared. As I said, I believe it's a vineyard. He has prepared the soil so that the soil is going to bring forth a great harvest. He has prepared the protection of that farm by building a wall around that farm. He has built a wine press. He has done everything that is needed to make sure that that farm is perfect in its ability. He goes away, but at the end of the harvest, he sends his servant back to the farm to get his portion of the crop. And the tenant refuses to give his portion to the servant. In fact, he even beats the servant. Now, this has happened several times where there was an expectation of profit, benefit from the farm, because it was his farm, yet the tenant is refusing to give him that credit or that ability to receive. And so we see here an example of perhaps our lives. God created this earth, and he created this earth in perfection. He equipped it with all that it would ever need. You know, we go through situations wherein we think there's no water, but there's water. The earth is made up of probably about 70% of water, so you could never be without water. It's abundant. We think, oh, they're going to run out of oil. We won't have oil in a few years. Oil? No. It keeps coming out of the ground. If they don't drill it, it will come out of its own ability. There are places where there are lakes of oil because the countries wouldn't drill. God's creation is not lacking. If we abuse it or we don't trust God, maybe there might be some what appears to be lack, but at the same time, you look at Israel, you look at Egypt, you see in the midst of that wilderness a well-watered garden. Why? Because they trusted God, and God takes care of them. When I was there, I saw strawberries that were like this big. My wife said, oh, one strawberry, one pie. Or a squash like this. It takes several men to pick it up because it's so big. Abundance. Why? The blessing of God. I believe it is a witness to all of us that if only we would walk with God, we would see that same blessing in our lives. We would see those same things as ours. God gave these to us. But what has happened is when we get a hold of something, we think it belongs to me. I don't know if you've ever tried to buy a piece of property, but you have to go through a tremendous amount of work to get that property. But just between us, don't tell anybody else, the owner of that property is not the one who owns the property. And even though you may have a title on that property, you don't own that property. It belongs to God. It's amazing how we forget to give God credit for what he's done. It's amazing how we murmur, we complain about certain things, not realizing, wait a minute, if there's anything lacking, it's not God's fault, it's man's. We're the one that causes the problem. And as this story talks about the tenant not wanting to give credit to the owner, so we don't give God credit for what he has given to us. We don't thank God for everything. Do we stop before we eat and thank him that he allowed the soil to take the seed and to cause it to grow and to prosper, to bring the fruit, the vegetable, whatever it may be, the grass for the animals to eat so that we could have meat? Do we stop and realize that? Do we give him credit for that? Well, most of us, we are murmuring and complaining because the supermarket charges too much. And it's not even theirs. And the poor farmer who does all the work, he doesn't get anything. Greed and lust that is among us, so that we are not really doing that which God gives us to do. And it literally becomes probably a sin that we hold back praise and honor and glory that belong to him. So this story that is here in Luke is a very powerful story to us, and it really is a clear picture of God and the kingdom of man, that which God has created. God is the creator, but do we give him any credit for what he has done? Are we praising him, worshiping him? And do we take the responsibility to honor him with what he's given to us? You know, in the Old Testament they talked about tithing, and how that at a certain period of time they had to bring their tithe to the temple 3 times a year. All the men were required to go to Jerusalem, and it says, don't come empty-handed. It was a command. Don't come empty-handed. It was a necessity of honoring God for what he had given for that period of time. It was like a tithe that was being brought to them. And in our lives, whether the tithing is material or whether it's praise, worship, there's a requirement for us to speak to God and to share our thanks with him. Thank you. Thank you for everything that happens in my life. Scripture says in all things. All things. That even means the things which we don't at the moment think are good. Well, you say, well, why would I give God thanks for things that aren't good? Why? Because if you are walking with God in a little while, those things which are not good are going to become good. God will turn it around. And so an attitude of thanksgiving, an attitude of praise to God for everything, giving him honor and glory. You know, we get on EDSA or C5 and, we want to maybe kill. But do we realize that in the midst of that anger, that unrest affects the physical body? Whereas if in the midst of that you can maintain an attitude of praise, peace, it will be, I won't say you're going to get through the traffic like the Red Sea parting, but I'm going to say you will not have the effect of that on your life. It won't be yours. Why? Because you have peace in the midst of it. Difficult? Yes. Yes. When the motorbikes pull in front of you just at the time when there's a clearing for you to be able to change lanes, you want to, but in peace, maintaining that peace, we have God on our side. And evaluate this with me. Can you see the patience of God toward us. He's giving to us time to learn, time to be able to know Him and to experience Him, because His whole purpose in life is that we are in a partnership with Him. Not doing the things on our own, but doing them together with Him for His glory and for His honor. And this story, I believe, really confronts us in our daily lives. Are we really giving God the credit for what He has done for us? Are we thankful every day for what He's given to us? Are we thankful for health? Are we thankful for the ability to think, to reason? You know, some people have Alzheimer's and some of the other things. They can't do these things. Are we thankful for what God has given to us? You know, it's an easy thing to murmur and complain because things might not be pleasant for a moment. But in the midst of that, giving thanks to God brings into our lives a peace and a joy that gives to us hope. The story goes on, whereas the owner of the property, having sent several servants and them being beaten, he then decides to send his son. And as the son approaches the farm, the tenants say, "Oh, here's the son of the owner. If we kill him, then we can have the inheritance." This story is written to the Pharisees and Sadducees, because this is what they were doing. They were the head of the temple. They were demanding from the people so much, but they did not give. They did not give credit to God. They did not give thanks to God. In fact, when the prophets came, they would kill the prophets. They didn't like what the prophets would say because it took away their power, it took away their prestige, it took away their glory. So they would kill the prophets. They get rid of them. Now that the Son has come, now that Jesus is there, what did they do to Him? They crucified Him. You can see in the story the comparisons or the imagery that's given to us to show us the picture of Christ, the picture of the kingdom, the picture of the temple, the Jewish people, how that they refused to give thanks to God, demanding glory for themselves. It said they enjoyed walking through the markets in their robes so people would honor them and bow to them. How that they would demand that the alms be brought to them, it would be theirs. You see that here God was speaking to us in a parable, a story, but at the same time telling us history, events that were going to happen. Christ was going to die. He was going to be killed. They were going to try to think we can control, this can be ours. This is not ours. The day will come when the reckoning will be demanded. And the question will be, what have you done with what I have given to you? What have you done with what I have given to you? This is what this farmer the owner was asking the tenant. What have you done with my property? What have you done with my planting? Have you had a harvest? If so, my part. In our lives, what have we done with the salvation that Christ has given to us? Remember in the Old Testament, He proclaimed He was a redeemer. He's not a destroyer. He's a redeemer. He would far rather restore a sinner than to destroy the sinner. But are we giving to Him that place in our life? Are we allowing Him the thanks that is really due unto Him? This is the question that comes now here in the last Sunday of Lent. Are we using what God gave to us to bring glory to Him? What is your gift? What is the gift that God has given to you? How are you using it? You know, there's several entertainers of the past that began their work, their singing, music in the church. A number of them in the U.S., a number of them. They started out singing for the church, but they eventually moved over to start working in the world and giving glory to the world. Elvis Presley was one. There was a number of them. Number of them. This is what this is confronting. What are you doing with what God gave to you? Are you using it for the glory of God? He's equipped every one of us. Every one. He does not miss anybody. All have been given gifts. And the question will be, what did you do with what was given to you? It's a question that we have to face one day. Are we giving God the first place in our life? Paul says nothing else counts but just being in this relationship with Christ, being in this partnership with Christ. It's the only thing Paul wanted. Nothing else really mattered. If he didn't have a home to live in, it didn't count. It didn't matter. He could live wherever. If he didn't have food to eat at that moment, it didn't matter. He could survive because he wanted this relationship with God. For how many years was he in the wilderness learning how to walk with God? He forsook everything. And that's the question. That's the thing that would be confronting to us. Are we totally consumed in making a way in this world's manner? Or are we putting Christ first? We may use this, but it's not our primary goal. Our goal is proving the greatness of God. I may become king. I may become president. I may become ruler, prime minister, whatever. But if I'm not putting God first, it's taking away from God, because he gave me the ability to be the king. He gave me the ability to be the president or the prime minister. And if I'm using it for self, I'm in trouble. Because one day I will have to account, what did I do with the ability he gave to me? Did I do it for his glory, for his honor? It's a challenge that each of us face now. Here we are, the last Sunday of Lent. What are we doing? What are we doing with the gifts he's given to us? Not for me, O Lord, but unto you. Unto you. If I don't get, I don't care, as long as I'm giving to you what is due to you. So may we be challenged. May we examine. Remember, Lent is to evaluate. Evaluate, where am I? What am I doing with what God gave to me? What are we doing? Before I get into trouble, I'll stop there. Challenge, God speaks to you. Prepare to meet your master. Prepare. Why? How? By doing what he's given to us to do. Now, please stand.